Jonathan is a celebrated spiritual writer and sought-after speaker, also a graduate of Eastern University and Duke Divinity School. In 2003, Jonathan and his wife Leah founded the Rutba House, a place of hospitality where the formerly homeless are welcomed into a community that eats, prays, and shares life together. Jonathan directs the School for Conversion, a nonprofit that has grown out of the life of Rutba House to pursue beloved community with kids in the surrounding neighborhood through classes in North Carolina prisons and in community-based education around the country. Jonathan is also an associate minister at the historically Black St. John's Missionary Baptist Church. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Tim. Well, thank you. It's a real honor to be here as a Baptist from North Carolina to talk with you all about the future of Anabaptism. I appreciate you inviting me. And as it happens, I occasionally get to talk with folks of various traditions in the country about their future. So I thought I would start by letting you know that you're not the only denomination with some anxiety about its future. I've been to similar gatherings with the Methodists and the Episcopalians and Methodists and even the Catholics. The monks several years ago called up and said, we heard that there's some Christians living in community and that you're young. They said, we're excited about that because we don't get many young people around here anymore. He said, so we'd love to be in touch. And said, after all, if you have any questions, we'd be glad to talk. We've been at this 1,500 years. So I like this idea of cross-pollination and the notion that we might learn something from our different traditions about the way of Jesus in the world today, which I take Anabaptists to be good at focusing us on. And as I've tried to make sense of my own journey to follow Jesus and the church's journey in the United States to figure out the way of Jesus in the 21st century, it seems to me that a large part of our future has to do with coming together from our different traditions to learn how to wage peace. And that is why I'm glad to be with Anabaptists. So a little bit of my background. I was raised a Baptist in the South in the heyday of the moral majority movement in the 1980s. When the best thing I could imagine to do for Jesus was to try to get to the White House, and of course with the Republican Party. I was an earnest kid, and I wanted to do all that I could for Jesus, and so Jesus always mattered, and we memorized the words of Jesus. We memorized them in the King James Version because if it was good enough for Jesus, it was good enough for us. We didn't need to change anything, and as I was growing up in King, North Carolina, which is just down the road from Mayberry, by the way. Mayberry, which is, of course, Andy Griffith's somewhat fictionalized hometown. But my granny actually grew up there, and our family's only claim to fame, really, is that Andy didn't change all the names when he wrote the show for television. So our Uncle Otis was the town drunk in the Andy Griffith Show. That's our family's claim to fame. But that's something of an aside. It was in the context of a very faith-centered community, people who really loved Jesus and talked about him like he lived, just over the next hill. That I really came to see that all of life was about following Jesus, and that's what I wanted to do with my life. And so it was a great crisis for me when I came to realize as a young adult and after 9/11 in this country that Christians don't agree always on what it means to follow Jesus. And in the aftermath of 9/11, when the church was trying to figure out how to respond to this thing that had happened, and when we started to have all these conversations about, what does it mean to respond to terrorism? Should we have a war on terror? And what might Christians have to say about that? It was for me an invitation into this diversity of traditions that we have in the church. I learned about the just war tradition, which I guess I was sort of part of, but I didn't know it existed, that there were Christians throughout the history of the church that had argued that, out of love for neighbor, sometimes Christians can support the use of violence, the use of lethal violence to defend the weak. And there were people who were arguing that a war in Iraq would be just. And so I learned that tradition, learned, that it's rooted in St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, and, these criteria that have been developed for saying when it would make sense for a Christian to support a war. I talked to some of the experts in that tradition and learned that what they were saying at that time was that a war in Iraq would in fact not be a just war. To go to war against Iraq would violate some of those basic principles of a just cause and of legitimate authority and things that had been laid down for centuries. The people who knew the most about just war actually said that we shouldn't go to war. And so I also got to know some of the Anabaptists, some of the Peace Church tradition, some of those folks who kind of always say that war is wrong. And I was talking to them too, and those folks were also saying, yeah, that there shouldn't be a war. But then I went to the Pentagon. By this time I was working as a journalist, and I was interviewing people about these war-related issues. And when I went to the Pentagon, I talked to a fella in one of the general's offices who knew a lot. He was a Christian and knew a lot about the just war tradition. He had studied it actually at Harvard. May have been at that same colloquium. He was a little younger, but may have been at that same colloquium that Hauerwas went 2 years ago. But at the end of that meeting, it was very clear to me that there was going to be a war. There was going to be a war, this fellow said, because Paul Wolfowitz wanted a war. And even though the Christian traditions that teach us to think about these things told us that we shouldn't go to war, every church I had talked to, every pastor I had talked to, knew that they were pastoring people who were praying for their children and their cousins and their friends who were already deployed, who were already in the Middle East. And so what do you do when everything that teaches you to think about what should happen tells you something shouldn't happen, and yet it is happening? And it's not just happening over there, it's happening with us. It's happening with our people, with Christian people. And as George Bush declared that, in 48 hours, if Saddam Hussein and his children don't leave the country, there will be war. Churches were gathering to pray for the troops and to pray for the nation as it went to war. This was something of a faith crisis for me, and what it did was it sent me asking: Is there any group? Is there any part of Christianity that I haven't discovered yet? Are there any people who are doing something other than simply saying this is terrible, but it's inevitable? And my wife Leah and I learned about a group called the Christian Peacemaker Teams. I had never heard of them before. I hope you all are familiar with them because the Church of the Brethren, as I learned, was involved in starting them. But this group called the Christian Peacemaker Team said that we've been engaged in direct action nonviolence, they called it, and we've been at this for over 20 years. And I said, well, what do you think about Iraq? And they said, well, we have a team there. We've been building up since last fall. We've been building up a peace team that is going to remain in Baghdad, whatever the U.S. government does, whatever the British government does with them. The team is going to remain there and be a witness for peace. And people from the U.S. and from the U.K. and from other places are coming together and saying to their governments and to the administration of the United States, whatever happens, we want you to know that we're going to be here. We're going to be here with the Iraqi people. I was quite moved by this witness and by the very concrete example of some people who said that there is another way. And so I wrote a letter. I thought it was a polite letter. It was a letter thanking them for their work and asking, if there was anything that a 20-something young guy could do to help, just let them know. I thought maybe, we could put stamps on envelopes or something. These organizations have to get the word out about things. A few weeks later, we got a call asking if Leah, my wife, and I would go to Baghdad. And we ended up leaving on the day when the bombing began in 2003. And so we met in Amman, Jordan, people who had been at this a while. I think CPT is wise. It's a little crazy to invite people in their young 20s to go into the middle of a war zone untrained, but they sent us with people who had been at it a long time. And in Amman, Jordan, I met a man named Jim Douglas. I didn't know who Jim Douglas was, but as it turned out, and as I read later, Jim Douglas had written some of the most important books in the 20th century on nonviolence, and was a scholar of Gandhi. And very, very patiently, as we waited in Amman, Jordan, to go to Baghdad, Jim taught us about Gandhi. I'm a Baptist kid from rural North Carolina. I didn't know a lot about Gandhi, but learned that, as Jim said, that the great challenge of his life as a Christian, raised Catholic in Canada and then in the United States, the great challenge of his life in the 20th century was that this man Gandhi, who was arguably the most faithful follower of the way of Jesus, had not himself been a Christian. And what does it mean for Christians to live in a world where people who are not Christian might follow Jesus more faithfully and actually do what Jesus said more faithfully than those of us who call ourselves Christian? I mean, this was no sort of wishy-washy, we're all climbing the mountain from every side sort of thing. It was an honest attempt to grapple with the reality of a life lived in the way of Jesus, even though it didn't claim Jesus as Lord. Jim taught us about how Gandhi had really introduced this idea of direct action nonviolence, of what Gandhi called satyagraha. That Gandhi had an incredible power analysis as an oppressed person under the British Empire. And what Gandhi had been able to see is that all violence is limited in its power, and that the real power of violent regimes is that they persuade people to go along with them because of the threat that they will hurt you, right? The exercise of violence actually diminishes power, which I think empires throughout history have learned, and the one that we're living in may be learning right now. The more you practice violence, the more enemies you make, the more money it costs, the more you erode trust with other people in the world around you. Violence is costly, and the more you actually have to use it, the less power you have. Gandhi saw this very clearly, and Gandhi said that the real power that people who exercise violence have is that the people who are afraid of them go along with them. Which is why Gandhi said there's a force more powerful in the world. The force that's more powerful in the world is truth force, he called it. This word satyagraha is truth force. Truth force says that if you refuse to cooperate with evil because it's wrong, and you align yourself with the truth, then you tap into something that's more powerful than the violence that could be threatened against you. Might you suffer? Yes. Might you even die? Yes, Gandhi said. But in the end, truth force will win. Gandhi said he saw this in the Bhagavad Gita that he'd grown up reading, but he also said he saw it in Tolstoy when he talked about Jesus. And so one time when Gandhi was on a ship traveling from the UK to India, it was Christmas. And the Christians on board asked Gandhi if he would give the Christmas sermon. This is a good sermon. It's a good sermon if you can remember every word of it. This was Gandhi's Christmas sermon. Living Christ means a living cross. Without it, life is a living death. He said, that's Jesus, and he sat down. Living Christ is a living cross. Without it, life is a living death. Seems to me that's a summary of the gospel that kind of resonates with Anabaptism. But it was right there in Gandhi, and as I was learning Gandhi in a little hotel lobby in Amman, Jordan, from Jim Douglas, who had been trying to learn Gandhi all of his life, in just this sort of simple attempt to follow the way of Jesus to something that offered an alternative where there seemed to be none, where there seemed to be an impasse, I began to grasp this imagination for what Gandhi had shown us, for what CPT was showing me, which is that the way of Jesus invites us to not just say that war is wrong, to not just say I'm not going to engage in it, I'll be quiet in the land, I'll stand aside. No, but to enter into conflict and to trust that there is a better way, that there is a force more powerful. We were sitting in that living room when the reporter from Newsweek showed up. He had heard about this group that was going into Baghdad the next day, and he wanted to try to make sense of this story. I'll never forget, he was sitting on this side of the circle. I was sitting beside Jim, who had been teaching us about Gandhi, and this reporter, in all earnestness, looked and said to the whole group, "Aren't you all afraid?" And it was quiet, and Jim spoke up and said, "Yes, I am afraid, but maybe not for the same reason you think." He said, "I think you're saying, aren't you afraid that you'll lose your life?" And I completely admit we could lose our lives. But my life is in God's hands, always, whether we're here or in Baghdad. So that is not up to me. He said, what I'm afraid of, what makes me very afraid, is that I live in a world where what's happening in Baghdad right now, the bombs that are falling, that we're watching on CNN, that's destroying a whole city, makes sense. Makes sense to so many people. And we can't imagine anything better. We left the next morning, drove through the desert into Baghdad, and were able to visit people who had already been living under the bombs, people whose homes had been hit, the collateral damage of these surgical strikes, that were supposed to only hit military, strategic military locations. We went and met the children in the hospital and met their parents, parents who had seen one child maimed and had lost another. A father who said, if this is democracy, we don't want it. If this is liberation, you can keep it. And yet, at the same time, in the midst of all of their pain, we met people who embraced us as human beings and who said to us, we love America. We do not like your president, but we love America, and we're glad that you're here. And in the midst of that terrible time where they had suffered so much and were directly under the tragedy of living on the other side of our bombs is to realize what it means for bombing to go on through the night, every night, and for people to not be able to sleep, and then to get up in the morning and stumble around and try to feed the kids and figure out what happened, and then to try to lay down again and the bombing starts. I mean, it's psychological warfare as much as it is an attack on bodies and infrastructure and everything else. And in the midst of that, we were traveling on a road through the desert in Iraq, and we were in 3 cars, and one of the cars hit a piece of shrapnel in the road. There was a lot of shrapnel on the road. This road had been bombed for 2 weeks by then. Bridges had collapsed. Cars had exploded. It was really a mess. And one of those cars hit a piece of shrapnel. It blew the tire. It crashed into a side ditch. 3 guys split their heads open in the middle of the desert, in the middle of a war. One of them was from the Church of the Brethren, Cliff Kindy. Some of you all may know him. Cliff was in the car, split his head open. And they stumbled out on the side of this road, not knowing what to do, and a car of Iraqis stopped, took them into their car, drove them to a town called Rutba. And in Rutba, they found a doctor who said, 3 days ago, your country bombed our hospital, but we will take care of you. And he sewed up their heads and saved their lives. Leah and I weren't in the car that wrecked. We were in a car in front of it, and so it took us a while to get back and find the empty car and see the blood and try to figure out where they had gone, and found this town of Rutba, and eventually found the place where this doctor had cared for them. A friend who had broken his collarbone was standing outside waving, and so we drove up to the place, and we went inside, and we saw that while seriously injured, everyone was still alive. And we learned this story about what the doctor had done and what he had said to them, and we said to the doctor, thank you so much for saving our friends. What do we owe you for your service? He said, you Americans, you always want to pay for things. He said, you don't owe me anything. But he said, please, go home and tell people what's really happening here. And so we came back to the United States in 2003, telling that story, telling people what was really happening in Rutba. And the more we told it, the more I realized, as a kid raised on the Bible, that it was a Good Samaritan story. Like literally, we had lived it. The people who were supposed to be our enemies had stopped by the side of the road and picked up our friends and paid for their health care and saved their lives. And at the end of that story, Jesus says, "Go and do likewise." We memorized that line. And so I knew that it was Jesus speaking to me, speaking to us, and that we had to try to find a way to live out the hospitality that we had received. That this whole thing of waging nonviolence and learning this way of following Jesus in the world, it wasn't about us being faithful. It wasn't about us sort of discovering a future. It was about receiving from people who we didn't even expect to be our teachers the truth of what God's way looks like in the world. And so we came back to Durham, North Carolina, and started a hospitality house there called the Rutba House. We named it after that village in Iraq of Rutba. And that's where I've been for the last 12 years, and that's where we've tried to make sense of what does it mean to live the way of Jesus in the world today, and what can we learn about waging peace. And I just wanted to share one thing here in this 20-minute TED Talk. I want to share one thing about what we've learned in our context that really reflects what got us there, reflects what we learned in Iraq, which is that the people who can teach us this way are already there. And for all of my life, I had been overlooking them. Because I was raised Baptist in the South, and Baptist in the South for a white guy like me means that I was Southern Baptist, and Southern Baptists are white Baptists, at least in part of North Carolina where I was from. And so I didn't know any black Baptists until I moved into the neighborhood where black folks had been living in Durham for the 100 years prior to our being there, and joined the Baptist church in the neighborhood and found that they sang the same songs and we used the same King James Bible, but instead of clapping on 1 and 3, we clapped on 2 and 4. And so I had a lot of relearning to do. And I started talking about what we had learned in Iraq about Gandhi and direct action nonviolence, and these folks in our congregation sort of shaking their heads, and they said, "Oh yeah, we know about that stuff. We were trained by CORE in 1960 when the sit-in movement started in this country. The story that's always told is that they started over in Greensboro in 1960, but as a matter of fact, we had the first one here in Durham in 1958. Reverend Douglas Moore trained 4 folks. We knew them all. We were going to high school with them, these ladies told me, and they did a sit-in at the Royal Ice Cream Counter. It didn't take off because the police decided not to arrest them. But the same Douglas Moore moved to Greensboro, and when he started sharing that story over there, well, you know what happened. And I realized that this whole tradition of waging peace, of getting directly involved in trying to use the power of nonviolence to not cooperate with evil anymore, but to change things, was something that everyday people had learned all throughout the South. They just all happened to be black. And I didn't know them. And I learned the story about how Jim Lawson, African American from Ohio, had been in India in 1955 when he read the newspaper article saying that the Montgomery bus boycott had started in Alabama. And the guy who was teaching at this little school with him in India said that he heard him shouting. And he went over into his apartment and he was dancing around with the newspaper, waving it over his head and saying, "It started, it started, it started." And what he knew as an African American was that Howard Thurman, great leader in the African American community in the mid-20th century, Howard Thurman had traveled to India before Gandhi died and had said to Gandhi, "We need you to bring nonviolence to America." And Gandhi said, "I don't need to come to America for nonviolence to come to America." Gandhi said, "Nonviolence will come to America when it comes to the Negro people of America. And when it comes to them," Gandhi said, "it will go to the whole world." And Lawson knew that, and knew that when the everyday people of Montgomery, Alabama had begun to understand that if the people on the buses refuse to treat you right, and you simply say, "We're not going to ride the buses anymore," and even though you try to come at us with the courts, and even though you harass us, and even though your police officers pull over our little ad hoc cab service, we're going to hold this thing out for over a year in order to demonstrate the power of nonviolence. then we begin to see the power that Jesus embodied, that Gandhi pointed us toward, and that is so often right here before us, even though we might miss it. So what is the future of Anabaptism? What is the future of the way of Jesus in the world today? I think it's in waging nonviolence. And in learning to do that with the unlikely friends who we find in fusion coalitions. As we are not maybe the leaders of what's happening, but rather people who stand in solidarity with those who already know how to lead and find a new way of being that is both deeply Christian and deeply engaged with the world around us. One of the things I've learned in the Black church is that all of this is embodied in singing. And so I would be remiss if I just stopped without inviting you to sing. So if you don't mind, I don't know if this fits in TED Talks, but if you don't mind, I'd like you to stand up where you are, because it's easier to sing these songs when your body can move. And I want to teach you Ella Baker's favorite song. Ella Baker from North Carolina, one of the great organizers of the 20th century. She was a mentor to SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And SNCC was the organization that started the Freedom Singers. And you all may have heard Sweet Honey in the Rock, the music group that Bernice Johnson Reagan started after she was with SNCC and the Freedom Singers. Well, Bernice Johnson Reagan used to lead the songs in the meetings where Ella Baker was there as mentor and guide. And whenever things got slow, Bernice says, whenever they weren't sure exactly what the way forward was, sometimes Miss Baker would reach over and touch her and say, "Bernice, sing my song." This was the song she meant. It goes like this. You can join me. It's a pretty easy one to learn. Guide my feet, Lord, while I run this race. Guide my feet while I run this race. Oh Lord, guide my feet while I run this race. For I don't want to run this race in vain, race in vain. That one may even be in your hymnal, huh? All right.